One.
Hello and welcome everybody to yet another hour in the 24-hour TWL podcast, raising money for Engineers Without Borders. We are currently at $3,001, which is wonderful for everybody. Everybody gets a round of applause.
Woo!
Just because we've reached 3,000 does not mean that we need to stop. The more the merrier, as they say. This hour, I am joined by two people that I have been very much looking forward to talk to. First is Julian Baggini. Definitely a very prominent philosopher as far as I'm concerned. Lots of very great works. Some of my favorites include What Philosophers Think, as well as The Ego Trick, What Does It Mean to Be You? All these things can be found online. I can also
recommend Do They Think You're Stupid and The Pig That Wants to Be Eaten.
Oh yes, The Pig That Wants to Be Eaten is...
The two copies of your books that I have, Dr. Baggini.
Thank you.
So you got a couple fans. You got a couple fans on the panel.
Thank you very much.
And the other one that I have with me right now is PhilosophyTube. Also, he's on YouTube. He's available for everybody to take a look at. There is a link down below in the stream if you want to check out his channel and figure out what it is he's all about.
Thank you very much. You can call me Ollie, by the way, please.
Ollie. Perfect. So, I suppose we should probably get started.
Lundi, just want to quickly interrupt, and we want to give a big thank you to Ollie, especially because he came in, like, just basically 24 hours ago. I know it's 48, so I'm losing track of times. But thank you very much. It was basically
my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It was basically Friday. I left work. We had a gap in the schedule. I emailed Ollie. He replied within an hour. So a big thank you to him for stepping in at the last. Just had to say that. So
it's my pleasure. I'm very flattered he thought of me. Actually.
Yep. All right, I'll disappear now.
Knowing Zulu, he just typed in philosophy into YouTube and it's just like, Big Lundi, do you know who this person is? Yes, I know who it is. Somebody who's awesome. He's like, okay, we'll put him on.
Thank you very much. That's very kind.
All right. So, I suppose we should probably get started. Both of you have done a variety of different topics as far as, I suppose we could call it public communication of philosophy in general. One of the big things that I usually get into as far as engaging with the public and philosophy is an extreme level of apathy. I think Dan Dennett said it best when he said, I'm a philosophy professor. What that means is when I go to parties and I tell people what I am, they go, oh. So there's just seems to be this complete apathy of philosophy, philosophers, people who just don't seem to see the point, I suppose. And I'd like to get
people even know what it is at all, of course.
Yeah,
several times I go, I study philosophy, and then 10 minutes later they go, so tell me about psychology, and I'm like, I've got no idea what psychology is. Never studied it.
Just because I'm a philosopher doesn't mean that I know a lot about these other things.
No, they think it's the same thing. It's like they just don't get it. They have no idea.
So I was wondering if
I think that's true.
give a bit of a statement as to why it is that you feel that philosophy is important for your general public to at least be semi-informed about. We'll just to have a little structure here. Let's go ahead and start with Ollie, and then we'll go over to Julian.
Oh gosh, why do I think philosophy is important for the general public? Well, I guess it does school you in having an analytic mind. It is useful in that regard. It's always good to analyze the ideas that you're given and that you see and that get fed into your life. I suppose that's very useful. I find it useful because it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy doing the conceptual exploration that comes with it. But I suppose, in a soundbite, generally thinking deeply and critically about things, and about all things in particular, because there aren't really any taboo subjects in philosophy. You can do philosophy about anything. So thinking deeply about certainly things that a lot of people take for granted or people think are sacrosanct, not necessarily religiously sacrosanct, but in the kind of untouchable assumptions that aren't to be questioned. And thinking critically about those things, I suppose, can be very useful. And also it would be personally nice for me if people were philosophically literate so that people wouldn't confuse it with psychology when I talk to them about it at parties, I guess.
Definitely good. Julian?
Well, suddenly this seemingly long hour seems very short because there's so much to say about this already. I mean, first of all, the earlier point about the lack of interest, I think that's changed, actually. And I think even the misunderstanding has changed a bit as well. Because, I mean, like Ollie, I remember when I first started doing philosophy and I said I was studying philosophy at university, people say, oh, so you're going to psychoanalyze me then? Get that same confusion, not knowing what it was. I think things really have changed a bit. There's a lot more public philosophy going on now, and so I think from that point of view, more people have a better idea. But why it's important? Well, I don't want to introduce disagreement just for the sake of it, but I actually do think there are concerns. It's very easy to point to what seems to be obviously and indisputably good about philosophy. So yes, thinking more for yourself, thinking more rigorously, thinking more analytically. I mean, who could be against these things? But it's kind of like it's not something that is automatically and necessarily a benefit, because I think it really matters that you do it in the right spirit, and that's not something you automatically get from finding out more about it. And I mean, why I think that's so important is that I have come across, I think, quite a lot of people who know anything between a little bit about philosophy right to a lot. This is not a criticism of people who are not professionals. The same thing happens with sometimes people who are really, you know, top of their game from a career point of view, which is that what philosophy has really done for them is that it's given them the tools to be able to rationalize and justify essentially what are their prejudices and bedrock intuitions. And so I think that all these tools of philosophy, which are wonderful, all these wonderful things are only really going to be of benefit if you bring the right spirit to them, which is that genuine, open-minded and self-questioning mentality. It's a self-questioning. A lot of people use it as a tool basically to question everything else. They become smart asses who love to look at whatever the latest op-ed piece in the paper is, or whatever the latest thing, and go, oh well, this is nonsense. Of course, as a philosopher, we know that's a fallacy, etc., etc.
That's an interesting point. Actually, I hadn't considered it like that. That you need to be able to. That it gives you the tools, but you need to be able to use it in the right way. You know, you need to be able to stay away from the dark side of the force and not use philosophy selfishly.
Well, yes, and
absolutely.
That's generally the problem that I find when trying to communicate online. For instance, like YouTube, you might be familiar with this little problem. Some people, like everyone on YouTube, seems to be very much knowledgeable as to what, for instance, the logical fallacies are. They don't seem to be very knowledgeable as to when they're supposed to be applied to an argument, when someone is supposed to point it out. They're not very good at actually analyzing an argument to figure out if it's actually being used. And then there's also the problem where even if I'll, for instance, source what I'm saying, if I'll source books, if I'll source the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, something along those lines to try and help people get a better understanding, if they just read it on their own, if they're reading it, going into it with an agenda, then there's going to be a misunderstanding as to what they're going to be reading. For instance,
certainly people going into things and not necessarily being open about it, not having that philosophical spirit, as you said, Dr. Baggini, can be a problem. I've noticed that sometimes people do have particularly when they watch my videos, some people, not many, do have the ideas that they have and aren't really interested in those being challenged. And I might address something in the video and talk about it, and then they'll say, what about this? And I don't want to be rude and say, you know, I literally just said that. I just talked about it. But you're right. Sometimes people do, I guess, use the dark side of philosophy to continue this metaphor that we're developing to back up prejudices.
Well, I think one problem is, of course, philosophy doesn't require any, or is not supposed to require any specialist factual empirical knowledge. I mean, it doesn't work in a completely empirical vacuum, but the kind of knowledge of the world you're supposed to need to do philosophy, according to standard accounts, is just the kind which is available to everyone. But I think, again, sometimes that trips people up. I mean, I'll give you an example of this, right? This is, again, a professional philosopher many years ago. There was this story you may well remember, you may have even talked about it, about the MMR vaccines. This is a combined mumps, measles and rubella vaccine. And there was a scare about it basically being linked to autism. And it was based on a report by, published in a journal, but it was extremely disputed, and over time...
It was formally retracted, I think. It was one of the big formal retractions the Lancet issued.
Here's the point. Well, when it got to the point when it was retracted, the editor of the Lancet, which I believe was the medical journal that published it, said that had he known, there's something about the funding of this study, because the study had been funded by a lot of people, partially or in full, I'm not sure, who were basically a skeptics group about the MMR vaccine. So the people funding the study had an agenda, and they published it. And the editor of the journal said that had he known about this funding, he wouldn't have published the paper in the first place. Now, that seems perfectly reasonable. Pops this philosopher who goes, well, there is this is an example of the genetic fallacy, which is the origins of an argument should not be the judge of its validity. So, typically speaking, if a person making an argument is a Nazi or member of the National Socialist Party, then actually that's irrelevant to judging the merits of the argument. The argument has to be judged on its own account. Now, this is all very well, but this is a kind of a very crude application of that rule, which is very naive about very important things you need to know about the workings of the real world. Now, in science, we just know very well that experimental bias is a very real problem. And the reason why you actually have to be very scrupulous about knowing who's funding a study and where it's coming from is because it has the capacity to interfere with the empirical results. So it's just a scientifically naive thing to turn around and say, well, it doesn't matter where the funding comes from because arguments must stand up according to their own credibility. It's taking a standard which would work very well if you're merely looking at a logical argument, but it doesn't work at all when you're looking about in empirical scientific studies where, again, we know that experimental bias can affect outcomes.
Well, yeah, I think it sounds like that particular philosopher perhaps didn't pick his fight or pick her, of course, and pick their moment especially well, because whilst it might have been a nice, might think, I'll teach everybody about the genetic fallacy and so on, in the real world, even though the fact that it was funded by those groups doesn't absolutely deductively establish it as being bad.
Yes.
It's obviously a very good indicator. So yes, I agree with you there.
Absolutely.
Sorry, is there a problem with the...
Oh, sorry.
There you are.
Technology. What are you gonna do? So we're all pretty much in agreement. There does seem to be an issue, at least some people, when they go into the researching of any one topic with sort of their own conclusions in mind or their own agenda in mind. It always sort of colors their studies in a way that's not exactly helpful to understanding the world in any sort of objective manner, as kind of weird as that term sounds, at least in that context. So I guess the question is then, would it be preferable to, and this is kind of my thought on this, to try and diminish that as much as possible? Would it be preferable to limit people's ability to gain this information, to do this research, unless it's under some sort of formal grounds? Like at the very least, somebody has to direct them to this stuff and help them understand it, rather than anybody can just go out and find whatever they want. Would that be perhaps an idea as far as trying to limit this happening?
Well, I suppose that's absolutely 100% directly relevant to what I do, which is trying to distribute philosophical knowledge to people freely and easily. I hadn't thought that maybe they'd be using it for evil. That's an interesting question. I suppose maybe one of the things you'd have to consider is what are the odds that they'd use it in a good way, and what are the odds that they'd use it in a bad way? And you might have to do some kind of weighing up of the likely outcomes of that. But I certainly probably wouldn't be comfortable with making philosophy some kind of elite club that only people who have studied for a long time and have a lot of money, especially in our country, and in America as well, have access to. So I probably wouldn't be entirely comfortable with restricting people's access to philosophy until they've proved it, because they've proved that that they can wield it responsibly. Because of course, making mistakes and using it badly would be how you learn to improve. So I'm not even sure how you would stop people doing philosophy. How could you restrict people's access to it? Just not have YouTube channels like mine and not have Dr. Baggini write his lovely books. And
Well, it's less that, because the way that you're doing it is in an educational form. You're not just saying, here is this concept and that's it. You're also explaining it to a decent degree. So obviously we're not going to be able to eliminate, even in the context of the possible fixing of the problem as I put forward, we're not going to be able to eliminate entirely somebody who's still going into this research with their own biases in mind. The thing is that sometimes, at least in my experience, somebody might be going in with their own biases, but they don't know that they're going in with their own biases. So they're just reading what they already thought into whatever subject they're actually looking into. I'm less interested in making it an elite club, and more interested in saying that information should always be done in a supplemental way. It shouldn't. In my opinion, it's more harmful in the public view, less the academic view, but in the public view, if it's just factual information just kind of thrown at them that they can just form whatever conclusion they want about without any sort of actual education on the matter. So, public speaking, YouTube videos, public books being written on the subject, all that to me is fine. It's more so when more technical stuff is introduced to the public, and without a proper understanding of what they're reading about, they can sometimes come away thinking very strange things.
actually, I believe there was a very good example of that a while ago, linking back to what we were saying about vaccination. They, I think, distributed a lot of information showing that vaccination did not have a link to autism, and then shortly after distributing that information, put round a survey saying, what do you think of vaccination? And apparently it actually negatively impacted people's views of it. So people can be quite resistant to information if you just give it to them and say, look, here's a list of facts. So that would be a good example of what you were talking about.
That's quite interesting. By the way, we are on first name terms here. By the way, Ollie's very nicely calling me Dr. Baggini, but the only person who calls me Dr. Baggini is my mother when she writes to me. Because so let's stick to that. That's such a pretty good example, actually, Ollie, because it's actually well known that this myth busting doesn't work. Again, and this is one thing I find very, very interesting. I think it's very important is the way in which I do think, although people confuse philosophy and psychology, in a way, philosophers could do with confusing the two a bit more in a more deliberate way. I think that sometimes it's psychological naivety which gets in the way. So there's a lot of research which shows that myth busting doesn't work. So a leaflet like that doesn't work. And why doesn't it? Because actually the way in which people form associations and beliefs is more by just mere exposure than it is by the details of the argument. So every time you put before someone the idea that there is a link between these two things, even if you're actually putting that information there to deny it, it's giving positive reinforcement to it. It's so no smoke without fire kind of effect. So myth busting,
the fact that you're even talking about it, people go, oh, well, why, if it's not a thing, why is it? It must be,
kind of like that, not even consciously, but like things around sort of immigration. So myth busting again, and a lot of people who campaign on issues like asylum issues and refugee issues, have kind of learned this the hard way. For years they went around thinking people are being misinformed by the tabloid press and hysterical campaign groups. If only they were to see the facts before them, they would realise the error of their ways. In fact, it's just what happened with the vaccine thing. It's taken to reinforce the fact there is something there real that's being talked about rather than just getting rid of it. But the broader point about access, I mean, I really don't think you just can't police the access in those ways, formally or informally, because actually, it's putting too much trust in expertise. So on the one hand, I certainly do have a lot of respect for people who have, in any discipline, who have really been doing it for decades and know the literature inside out. And of course, I think those people, in important senses, on average, have a much greater understanding than the layperson. But we also know that acculturation and can lead people into kind of established ways of doing things which are sort of wrong or misguided or blind alleys. And so if you get those people in any way kind of policing what's meant to be sort of proper and good in that discipline to too far an extreme, you're going to cut down on innovation. I think the real problem issue here really is it's more of a broader cultural one. I mean, this is going to sound to some people that's horribly kind of undemocratic and elitist in another way, but I think there's a real problem in that the culture we have now is the kind of everyone's entitled to their opinion kind of thing. Anyone can become a blogger or a publisher or something, and this is not something I'm being critical of. I started the Philosopher's magazine from scratch, so I'm a self-made, self-started publisher in a Philosopher as well. So in no way can I be against people just doing it. But this culture, anyone can do it. Everyone has a right to do it. Even on news programs and discussion programs, it's always, tweet, let us know what you think, send us emails. Now, this is good up to a point, but the point is that people need to appreciate the fact that merely having an opinion isn't good enough. You've got to be able to sort of give good grounds for it and to justify it. And it's then the test is
I'm entitled to my opinion with I'm entitled to not have my opinion challenged.
Yes, exactly. You're entitled to your opinion means you're also entitled to believe complete nonsense. You're entitled to it, but it doesn't make it not nonsense. And the question of whether it's nonsense or not isn't settled by the person's CV. So this is why it's not actually it's not an elitist point in that sense. It's not elitist, but it's not completely egalitarian either. Some opinions and some views are better thought through than others. And I think that people need to sort of have that that challenge needs to be there more strongly, and that's the thing to counter this kind of if you want to go through the most technical paper in any kind of discipline in order to give your view as an outsider, you'll be perfectly entitled to do that. But of course, you'll expect yourself to have to do that in a way that is very rigorous and will be subject to scrutiny. And if you get things wrong, you'll be criticised, and people won't say, well, yeah, that's fine, great, you're entitled to your opinion.
Do you think that philosophy and people being exposed to that with its practice and insistence on backing things up and so on might help that problem? Do you think people studying philosophy or maybe reading philosophy books or watching philosophy YouTube videos, do you think that situation might be helped in a small way by that?
Well, it goes back to what I was saying in my opening sort of comments, really, which is that I think they can, but it's really not necessarily. And I'm not even sure. I must admit, I'm not even sure what I think the tendency is. I mean, I would have thought that on average, a person who does that kind of thing, who sort of has that kind of philosophical knowledge, is going to be more likely than others to have a more thought through and balanced position. And I think that's probably true. But I'm only saying probably. I really don't know for sure, because I see so many examples of, again, people basically just kind of, taking their knowledge and their skills to basically back up what they do. And I see so many people kind of doing philosophy, I think, in the wrong spirit, which, I mean, there are many wrong spirits of doing philosophy. One, for example, is I find that people are much too keen to sort of have an original position in some way, Mm-hmm. So when I was doing the magazine, I kept getting sent things by people who claim they have a radical new theory, and there's very little completely radical and new in philosophy, and people seem to be less concerned with getting things right than they are with having their view, which can kind of have their authorship on it.
I have certainly
just
found
another
that YouTube.
Yeah. So I think, again, that's another real issue there. So of course it will help, but I just think we need to really always stress all the time and stuff that you got to approach it in the right way. And my introductory books, I kind of always aware of that, and there's always, I think you'll find somewhere in towards the end or at some point where I'll be kind of saying, listen, it's not just about reading this and internalizing it, taking my word for it. It's actually about are you gonna think about things in the appropriately self-critical spirit. I think the self-critical thing is actually probably the key, to be honest. It's that question of checking against yourself, because it's very easy. I mean, I do it too. You know, you have an idea and you think, wow, this is great, this is fantastic. You know, your own ideas always seem absolutely brilliant and works of genius. And when you're in an academic setting, you know, whether it's studying or with peers and colleagues, you will soon have that view really scrutinized by others, and it will force you to check it. Whereas when you're at home, and I work from home in isolation. When you're home, it's very easy for you just to run away with it, and without other people making that challenge, you have to be your own best self-critic.
Yeah.
It's definitely key, I think, in most sort of public communications of not just an idea, but also disagreements. For everyone involved to be as self-critical as possible. I do find that, at least in the essence of popular articles, there is a bit of a lack of this, whether that be on personal blog sites or YouTube or forums or anything along those lines. You really do hit the nail on the head when you say that your own ideas always seem like they're brilliant until you actually sort of analyze them for yourself. It might be the best way to really look at your own ideas is to just picture the person that you hate the most in your life, the person you can't stand, making the same argument, saying the same argument. Because you will just, like, I want to say you're wrong. So that seems to be very helpful. But there is the issue of people not doing that, and I'm wondering, like, what would be. It's kind of hard to encourage people to not think of themselves as intelligent. You know what I mean? Like, how do you fix the issue of someone not being self-critical? How do you encourage them to do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I like the technique, by the way. I think that's a really good one. Imagine somebody you don't like saying it, because actually, and I think people can identify with that, because if there's one thing that makes you doubt your own views, it's when you hear someone you really don't like say something spookily like what you agree with. You suddenly think, oh, maybe I'm not so right after all. It's also a good exercise, actually, also in perhaps sympathy for others. Recognizing that sometimes people we don't like in lots of ways aren't wholly wrong. How do you do it? I don't know. I mean, I just think that, it has a long heritage, of course. This famous and cliched Socrates thing about, being the wisest man in Athens because he knew nothing. It becomes a bit of a cliche, and it can become just another way of just actually boosting your own ego to think that, but I just think that kind of humility should come just from looking around you and looking at yourself. I do kind of take I don't know, it depends on what hour of the day it is, but in some ways I do take quite a dim view of humanity. I think it's amazing, actually, what we've managed to achieve as a species, given the fact that we're so dumb in so many ways. And you look around and you see people, and you see even the people you most admire. There are very few people who are really smart kind of across the board. Everyone has their blind spots. Everyone has their weaknesses. So some people. Yeah, some people, there have been brilliant thinkers and even great moral thinkers who have made complete pig's ears of their personal lives, and in ways which is ethically important. It's not just that they've chosen inappropriately; they've actually treated their own families badly because they've become so wrapped up in the big moral and political issues of the day. I think, if you just take an honest look at us, you'd think, look, we're all remarkably flawed. Now, either I am the one unflawed person in the universe who is really a great genius, or I too have these flaws. And I think that the most of us, there are probably some people who are really brilliant. There are some really brilliant people who I kind of wouldn't blame them if they had delusions of grandeur. But, for the rest of us, even if you're doing pretty well in your field, you know that you mark yourself up against the greats, Even the greats got things hugely wrong. You could read passages in Descartes and Kant and think, what a howler, that's a terrible mistake.
Aristotle as well. Some of Aristotle's ideas of physics.
Aristotle! Oh,
You didn't
God,
even have.
yeah, I mean,
What do you think of that? You could have just gone outside and checked. Like that would have been better.
Yeah, I know. So I mean, I think it should come, but it takes a kind of practice. I think it takes a kind of you have to kind of be in the habit of reminding yourself of this. And I think one difficulty it is, in the sense, it requires you to be emotionally strong. I think people find it difficult because actually, again, and I'm sort of railing against, I sound like an old fogey here, railing against the culture, but we do have this great thing about self-esteem and self-confidence, which I think there are good things about that. But I think that in some ways that has discouraged that kind of self-criticism and self-doubt. The point is to accept your own limitations, to accept that in lots of ways you are a dumbass like everyone else, is not to despise yourself or to be uncompassionate to yourself or to think that you're worthless. It's simply to sort of, in a sense, it's being kind to yourself and not expecting too much. And you strive on just doing better, a little bit better next time. And I think it's a perfectly reasonable attitude, but I think some people find it hard to do because it slides into self-loathing, which it shouldn't do. You shouldn't hate yourself just because you recognise there are huge limits on yourself and you're capable of idiocy.
I think inviting feedback can be quite helpful with that as well. If you have an idea or a theory or something, and you put it out there and say, if there's any questions or problems with this, let me know because I want it to improve. That's certainly something I try to do a lot with the channel. I mean, if the ones you've seen, you might know that I always go through the comments from the previous episode at the end of every episode and talk about the questions and the issues that arise. And sometimes people actually really do say things, and I'm like, wow, I never thought of it that way. You're probably right about that, and I do change my mind. So. Yeah, inviting feedback, I think, is good. I suppose also we can see by looking at history that when people put aside their personal biases, things do work, certainly with the history of science. I mean, a lot of people thought that tectonic plate theory was absolute nonsense, and then, when that was eventually, when they put aside their biases against it, they found out it was actually true. So being aware of your personal biases as a strategy for finding truth has historically been quite successful.
Just to go ahead and interrupt just for a second. Currently, we raised another $10 this hour. We have another 24 minutes to go. I'm wondering, Julian, if you'd be willing to do us a favor. Would you be willing to offer perhaps an autographed copy of one of your books for a decent-sized donation?
Oh, of course. Yeah. No problem at all. You can pretty much take your pick, if you like, about which one you want. I think I've got spares of most, and then someone's going to pick the one I don't have a spare of, aren't they? But yeah. Or do you want to specify now?
Any book that the donator would like, if that's an available option. I think they probably like that.
Yeah. Come on, yeah. If it's as long as I've got a copy, I'll get one. I'll get one sent. Absolutely, yeah.
So let's go ahead and say for everybody who donates $25, I think that's fair. They'd get an autographed copy of one of Baggini's books. Whichever one that's in his collection that you'd like. So
if there's a way of finding out who's actually been donating the money and their names, then I can't offer anybody a free autographed copy of anything important, but I'd certainly be happy to give them a shout out on the show if they wanted that. As a supplemental prize. It's not exactly an autographed book, but it's the most I can do.
Well, I'm making sure that I'm looking at the chat. So if anybody makes a donation and they want to specify in the chat that they made the donation and for what, then I'll be able to see that and I'll be able to let you guys know the details.
What's to stop people saying they've made donations?
I was just saying, like, when you make your donation, you can put a message in, so you can put the title of your book in, and you can provide a postal address, and I can pass it on to Julian.
Cool. That's so cool.
Oh, great. I'll tell you what, though, I've also got. I'll tell you what I've got a Spanish language edition of the Ego Trick. So anyone wants a Spanish language edition, there you go. La Trampa del Ego.
That was so cool. That was just like Scotty, the technical guy, just coming in from nowhere. He's been eavesdropping on our conversation the whole time, just interjecting with the voice of Scottish technological authority.
I like how you just called him Scotty.
Yeah, because he just kind of chipped in. It says, "I can make it happen, Captain." It's great. I actually, I have "Do You Think You're Stupid" here, Julian, which was given to me as a philosophy prize in school.
Really?
I came top of my year in philosophy, and they gave me a copy of your book as a reward. I remember reading it. It was good fun. Actually, it inspired me to, or played a role in inspiring me to go on and study philosophy. So
that is a wonderful book to give to somebody as a reward. Why do people think you're stupid?
Do they think you're stupid? Yeah, actually,
why they think you're stupid?
They do think you're stupid. They might think you're stupid, but why?
I hadn't thought of it. That's possibly a sneaky dig by my headmaster.
You brought up just sort of as kind of an offhand joke, some bit of Star Trek. I actually find that one of the most valuable things, as far as the public is concerned with philosophy, is that it can always be applied to whatever media, whatever society it is being exposed to. Star Trek, in my opinion, is definitely one of the big ones.
Oh yeah, definitely. I was always more of a Next Generation than original series, but there's some great stuff in especially in Next Generation, where we must stick to the Prime Directive, and the Prime Directive's very, very Kantian. It's kind of like, don't interfere if things go wrong. That's not our fault, but we don't interfere with people. So I definitely think you're right. And actually, reading philosophy into things is a great way, and I'm trying to do more of this on the channel, like teaching people about it, to say, look, here's this thing that you guys all know, but did you actually ever realize that there's another way of thinking about this? Have you ever seen the show Rick and Morty?
Yes, I love that show.
Yeah, I've got a script and an episode upcoming, hopefully next week, which is going to be about the philosophy of Rick and Morty. So it's a good one, and like plays as well. So yeah, it's really good.
It's a great tool for helping people to not only better understand, but better enjoy, at least in my opinion, whatever media they're experiencing. And because whenever I want to actually have like a conversation about like the inner philosophy of a show or a movie or anything like this, somebody will always tell me inevitably, "Oh, it's just a show," or "Oh, it's just a movie. You don't have to think about it that much." Well, why not? Why not think about it a little bit more?
Absolutely,
that's part of the fun.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right.
But just when you understand the concepts, it also becomes a lot easier to recognize when it's happening, because sometimes it's subtle. Like you brought up the Prime Directive with the Next Generation in Star Trek. There's also egalitarianism. And that's a huge thing in Star Trek. Like so many different races working together. There's very little thought actually paid to the differences of the different species, aside from what it would do to impact, for instance, command or anything like that. And it really does sort of show a bit of an opinion as to what that society would be like, and essentially it's fairly successful. And that's just one thing. Like each individual episode will have its own sort of philosophical message that you can sink your teeth into. It's like and it's not the only one. You can look at something as simplistic as like kids cartoons and definitely find something fairly deep to analyze in whatever it is. It just boggles my mind whenever an analysis comes up for a show. And other people will complain that the show is being analyzed. Like, for some reason, it's taking away the fun for them.
First of all, you don't have to listen to the analysis. Like, if somebody makes a video saying, this is the philosophy of Star Trek, and you're like, come on, man, this is the show. You're like, well, you don't have to watch that video, and it's not like, you're right, it doesn't detract from it. It doesn't stop you watching it. It's people going, oh, I don't want to think. I don't want to be challenged. I didn't come here to, think about deeper themes. It's a pain in the butt. In fact, the same is not only true of like TV shows and stuff, but I've found as a stand-up comic as well. Some of the time, I've found that people really don't like stand-up comedy being challenging or intellectual. You'll frame something in a certain way that's supposed to get people to think about a topic, and a lot of the time it goes over well, and some people are just like, I don't get it. I didn't come here to be challenged. Why is he talking about this? Why is he not talking about how his girlfriend's different from him? I don't get it. I'm uncomfortable by comedy that I don't understand. Like people aren't interested in comedy, especially a lot of the time, being intellectually challenging. So, but you're right. I mean, it doesn't detract from the original thing. If somebody says, I really like Star Trek and it makes me think, then it doesn't stop you enjoying it. So I don't know what people's problem is with that.
Yeah, it's usually the comedy is challenging, isn't it? Because I mean, obviously people say they like satire, but I think it was John Lloyd, the legendary comedy producer, not like on News, also QI more recently. I remember an interview with him in it, which he was saying that satire is actually one of the most conservative forms of comedy going, because actually when people watch satires, what they generally are watching is having their own political beliefs reinforced, you know. So oh, look at them, they're a bunch of incompetent fools. Oh, look at them, they're venal, greedy, and so forth. And I think there's something true, you know. Comedy, you know, maybe comedy just isn't actually the best vehicle to do truly challenging things, because it makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, but not too uncomfortable. There's always going to be that familiarity there. So I think that there are issues around that. But in terms of the popular culture stuff, I think again it's absolutely fair enough. There's been a huge explosion of them. Open Court started their series years ago now with these books on Seinfeld and The Simpsons and philosophy, and they've done zillions since, and so Blackwell have done them. There's a heck of a lot out there, and I think overall, these are good ways in for people. The only sort of caveat I have about them is that sometimes I think people mistake the ability to be able to, draw on something for lots of philosophical analysis to it actually being genuinely philosophically deep itself, and that often isn't the case. I mean, things like Star Trek actually are, have always been very thoughtful and very deliberately, philosophically interesting in that way. But some of the things these books are about, in a sense, you can philosophize about anything. It doesn't mean you should, of course, but it also means if you do, it doesn't therefore prove that the thing you're philosophizing about is itself really rich. I can philosophize about a hamburger, but a hamburger is not a philosophical thesis.
So one of the commenters, Bod to Bits, said that he wants us to analyze episode 1 of Monty Python, which would be fun. But because we only have about 14 minutes to go, if we got like an $89 donation and got up to $3,100, that would be probably something we could give a shot for. Other than that, though,
I can't remember what happens. It's been
a long time. It would probably essentially be like watching a new episode for me at this point. As long as it's been since I've watched the entirety of Monty Python.
What was in episode 1?
They've just reunited, haven't they? Or they did a live show.
Doing some stage show, yeah. Well,
because they need the money.
They need the money, apparently. Extraordinary. Expensive divorce for John Cleese.
I wasn't going to say that, but I was thinking it very loudly.
No, he said it himself. He did his last tour was kind of the alimony tour or something like that. It was like he's not making a secret of it. He's got to pay something off. Yeah. Well, but the Pythons, I mean, they were very explicitly. I mean, the philosophical stuff there. You don't have to kind of invent anything. A lot of it really was there. In fact, I did do a talk once on the philosophy of Monty Python, and I have. Do you want to hear my Python philosophy thesis, as it were?
Hey, go for it.
Go on. Okay, right. So basically, I mean, there is a kind of unifying kind of view behind it. They do lots of skits which are based on specific things, but I think, basically Monty Python represents the kind of the Anglo-Saxon alternative to French existentialism. So in French existentialism, Camus, Sartre, you have the meaningless and the pointlessness of the world. And it's a cause of kind of despair and anguish and perhaps defiance. Now, in Python, you get exactly the same kind of sense that the world is absurd, but rather than the donning the black polo neck and smoking you just laugh at it. You deal with it by seeing its absurdity and actually laughing. Because actually, all the films, I think this is true of the films. I mean, if you think of the films, they're all about debunking these grand narratives, aren't they? Monty Python, the Holy Grail, and the Life of Brian, and the meaning of life. What they're doing in all those things is they're taking these things that historically human beings have told stories about themselves, which are these huge self-important grand narratives. And the Python kind of take on it, which is the existentialist one, is that this is basically nonsense. There is no higher purpose, no higher goal. It's all a bunch of self-deluding nonsense. And people are comical when they buy into it and believe themselves to be part of this. And once you realise it's nonsense, all you do is you hang on the cross, dying, whistling, and singing a song. Because
I suppose that's very explicit at the end of Holy Grail, isn't it? Where it's literally shown to be a bunch of people running around fields doing nonsense, and it's like it's not King Arthur at all. They're actually just a bunch of nutters, and then they get arrested.
Yes,
so,
yeah.
It's a good way of putting it.
Oh, Holy Grail was definitely my favorite thing about Monty Python ever. More than Life of Brian, which a lot of people will disagree with me on that, but I'm sorry. Holy Grail has a special part in my heart. So let's see. We got about 10 minutes left in this part of the show. So we brought up comedy a little bit, and people's sort of aversion to comedy that makes them think. Not everyone, but obviously there is a proportion of people who do that.
It's very frustrating when you're on the stage and you're trying to do something funny that's also challenging, and people are like, ah.
But see, to me, it has to do with the phrasing, I guess. Like, for instance, George Carlin, that's pretty much all he did, was say as many controversial things as possible in, like, the span of an hour or 2 hour show. And that got resounded very well. And it's possible that it might have less to do with the fact that he said something challenging, and more the fact that his audiences are simply those who already, like, a priori agreed with the notions that he was putting forward, rather than they were actually being challenged. But I find that, for instance, we talked about being self-critical. Comedy is definitely the best way, in my experience, to point out maybe flaws with a manner of thinking or a particular type of philosophical position, because it's lighthearted. It's not meant to be something that people get extremely offended by. It's not something to, like, have a war about. It's a comedy routine. It's a joke, but at the same time, it helps them think. So it's still definitely very useful in that aspect.
I don't know. I think jokes can be. You say the kind of critical comedy is lighthearted, but critical comedy can be absolutely savage. You ever seen Stuart Lee? He's pretty much, in my humble opinion, the master of intellectual critical comedy. Like he can make you feel like an absolute fool when you watch him, and it's savage. Not because he's saying, not because he's railing and saying this is all nonsense or this is all nonsense, but he's very ironic, and he always frames what he's doing as a parody or a send up or something. Like he does a good send up of UKIP, who are a right wing British political party's views on immigration, and he presents himself as very much agreeing with it, and then just extends it and runs with it to an absolutely ludicrous conclusion where he starts saying, I wish Neolithic man had stayed in Europe and never come to Britain, and the best Neolithic men should have focused on making Europe a good place to live instead of coming over here with their tools and, like, stealing our jobs and stuff. And he just takes it and runs with it. So I'm not sure that intellectual critical comedy necessarily has to be controversial in the sense of railing against stuff, or necessarily lighthearted. It can just be just trying to get people to think about something as well as making them laugh. And sometimes people are resistant to that, not because they're going, oh, this is very sweary and I don't like that kind of comedy, just because they're not used to it, really.
I mean, also comedy can be very exclusory. I mean, I can't imagine, for example, sort of a lot of the old school comedy, did depend on things which we'd now find very uncomfortable indeed. I mean, if you were to be in a sort of a working men's club in the 60s or 70s and you were homosexual, for example, there'd probably be moments where you'd be feeling extremely difficult, awkward indeed. Similarly, if you're sort of like an ethnic minority, I think there is a lot of humour which, perhaps more than we might like to acknowledge, is based upon identifying the outsider groups and laughing at their expense, and so I think it's nothing inherently sort of light or inclusive or friendly about comedy. It can be very vicious, and I think that's something about the best philosophy. It's probably the best philosophy and the best comedy has that knack of doing both. You must make you sort of like feel a bit uncomfortable yourself. I think Alan Partridge. Now, I don't know. Alan Partridge probably isn't big in the States. He's a very, very British character. But he's this comedy character, and he's this grotesque man in lots of ways. But the point about him is that he does so many of his things are just quite normal bloke things, you might want to call them. Just that little bit, pushed that little bit too far. And much as you kind of recognise that he is a kind of quite horrible character, I defy anyone to sit through any kind of episode of the show or the film and not to, at least at some moments, recognise bits of themselves in him. And that's what kind of saves it from just being that kind of savage mockery of another person and making it
a sympathetic
something
character
whatever.
as well. You still
Yeah.
kind of feel sorry for him when he like loses his job, even though he did lose his job because he punched somebody in the face with a partridge stuck on his hand.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. You sometimes find yourself rooting for him. So, for example, he's a complete Philistine. He's absolutely complete Philistine. Doesn't understand anything intellectual at all. And yet, at the same time, most of us who sort of like to think we're not like that, there are always things, aren't there, where we think, yeah, but come on, that's just pretentious. That's just whatever. And you know, he sort of like allows that kind of inner Philistinism to sort of come out of it. And you do find yourself thinking a lot of the time, well, maybe he's got a point out that, you know.
It's definitely good to. It really. Comedy is such a very nuanced network of rhetoric. It's really difficult to pin down the difference between a joke that makes you cringe and a joke that makes you laugh about the same subject. Like, what is it about the phrasing, or what was it about the delivery, or what was it about the jokes that made me react so much differently in one aspect and so much differently in the other. I think so long as the joke is successful in causing laughter, then I think then the memory of the point of the joke is probably a lot more likely to stay with you than if you were to be sort of offended by it. If you're offended by it, then you're just going to sort of shut off the point of the joke. But if you laugh at it, then that's sort of just kind of inserted into your thoughts a little bit. At least that's just my sort of interpretation of it.
Well, I wouldn't know much from a position of experience because I tend, when I do stand up, not to focus on offending people. I like people to leave the show feeling better than they did when they came in, but hopefully a little bit clever as well. But I mean, yeah, I might tentatively agree with you, but willing to change my mind if people are people say otherwise. I mean, you can do both. You can be kind of a little bit offended by something and laugh at it as well. Doug Stanhope, who's an American comedian, is master of that. He's brilliant, and some of his stuff is quite socially and intellectually challenging. And you think, wow, you're right, but also, ha, that's hilarious, but also, that's disgusting. So yeah, it is interesting because it's not an exact science. It tends to be vague, and there are some mysteries about comedy. Like, one of the big mysteries is if you read a transcript of some of Eddie Izzard's earlier work, you'd be like, what the hell's this? This doesn't make any sense. This isn't funny at all. And then when you watch him do it, it's hilarious. And it's difficult to explain why. So it is a very fun pastime, and there is a lot of good, deep thought to be done with it.
So let's see. We only have about 3 minutes left to go as far as
Just got the 2-minute warning from Scotty.
Oh dear. So I guess we have to start wrapping up. So I guess first thing is to ask both of you if you have any sort of final thoughts about the past hour, or any sort of plugs that either one of you would like to do. Now,
I'm happy to plug.
Time.
I'm happy to plug Julian's books for anybody who hasn't read them. People often ask me what's a good way of getting introduced to philosophy, and I would recommend either of the two ones that I have, which are The Pig That Wants to Be Eaten or Do They Think You're Stupid, which I read when I was 16, I think, and was a lot of fun. So I will plug his material because it's good.
We'll do some mutual plugging, but I think that's also the plug for. Actually, I don't know. You probably do this on the hour anyway, but the Engineers Without Borders. This sounds like a great cause. Could we perhaps use our last minute or so just to sort of remind ourselves what the cause we're supporting here is?
That's a fantastic idea. Engineers Without Borders, for anybody who is not familiar with their work, what they do is they go into, very similar to Doctors Without Borders, the people who go into places that are lacking of sufficient medical care. Engineers Without Borders is very similar in the sense that it goes to places that are very destitute, that are very in need of a variety of different services, such as clean water, electricity, all these different amenities that we in first world countries sort of take for granted. And the Engineers Without Borders, what they do is they go out and they make sure that everybody has at least these basic amenities that can at least make it so that people are more comfortable living with the lives.
Seriously cool.
This is definitely a very good cause to donate to, and I think everybody will feel a lot better knowing that they helped support that cause.
Yeah, and actually, when going back to the thing about philosophy, its limits and its values, I think that when you think about people who choose to do that kind of work and the people who choose to support it against those who don't, I'd bet pretty much to the house. I think that the difference is not that the people who do it have a better developed moral theory. You see what I mean? I think when it comes to fundamental human goodness and kindness, the moral philosophy can sort of help you perhaps tidy up your thoughts so that you make fewer well-intentioned mistakes perhaps. But fundamentally, whether people choose to sort of do good things for the benefit of others or not, I think is probably got virtually zero correlation with how well developed their moral philosophical views are. So there you go, the limits of philosophy, but the value of what we're talking about philosophy for today.
Well, all right then, fine.
Another time next year.
Don't have time to.
I want to talk about that, but we are out of time. All right, so I would like to thank both Dr. Baggini and PhilosophyTube / Ollie for joining me for this hour. Very much appreciate both of you being here, especially Ollie for being here on such short notice.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. I'm flattered that you thought of me.
Well, so I guess that's the hour. The next hour is, let me double check to make sure that I have this correct. The next hour is going to be Katie Steckles, who is going to be hosted by Sarah and Mortimer. So look forward to that for the next hour, and everybody have a great day.
Bye.
Standing has changed a bit as well, because I mean, like Ollie, I remember when I first started doing philosophy, and I said I was studying philosophy at university. People say, "Oh, so you're going to psychoanalyze me then?" Get that same confusion, not knowing what it was. I think things really have changed a bit. There's a lot more public philosophy going on now, and so I think from that point of view, more people have a better idea. But why it's important? Well, I don't want to introduce disagreement just for the sake of it, but I actually do think there are concerns. It's very easy to point to what seems to be obviously and indisputably good about philosophy. So yes, thinking more for yourself, thinking more rigorously, thinking more analytically. I mean, who could be against these things? But it's kind of like it's not something that is automatically and necessarily a benefit, because I think it really matters that you do it in the right spirit, and that's not something you automatically get from finding out more about it. And I mean, why I think that's so important is that I have come across, I think, quite a lot of people who know anything between a little bit about philosophy.
Analytic mind, it is useful in that regard. It's always good to analyze the ideas that you're given and that you see and that get fed into your life. I suppose that's very useful. I find it useful because it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy doing the conceptual exploration that comes with it. But I suppose, in a soundbite, generally thinking deeply and critically about things, and about all things in particular, because there aren't really any taboo subjects in philosophy. You can do philosophy about anything. So thinking deeply about certainly things that a lot of people take for granted or people think are sacrosanct, not necessarily religiously sacrosanct, but in the kind of untouchable assumptions that aren't to be questioned. And thinking critically about those things, I suppose, can be very useful. And also it would be personally nice for me if people were philosophically literate so that people wouldn't confuse it with psychology when I talk to them about it at parties, I guess.
Definitely good. Julian?
Well, suddenly this seemingly long hour seems very short because there's so much to say about this already. I mean, first of all, the earlier point about the lack of interest, I think that's changed, actually. And I think even the misunderstanding.
Hello and welcome everybody to yet another hour in the 24-hour TWL podcast, raising money for Engineers Without Borders. We are currently at $3,001, which is wonderful for everybody. Everybody gets a round of applause.
Woo!
Just because we've reached 3,000 does not mean that we need to stop. The more the merrier, as they say. This hour, I am joined by two people that I have been very much looking forward to talk to. First is Julian Baggini. Definitely definitely a very prominent philosopher as far as I'm concerned. Lots of very great works. Some of my favorites include What Philosophers Think, as well as The Ego Trick, What Does It Mean to Be You? All these things can be found online.
I can also recommend Do They Think You're Stupid and The Pig That Wants to Be Eaten.
Oh yes, The Pig That Wants to Be Eaten is
the 2 copies of your books that I have, Dr. Baggini.
Thank you.
So you got a couple fans. You got a couple fans on the panel.
Thank you very much.
And the other one that I have with me right now is PhilosophyTube. Also, he's on YouTube. He's available for everybody to take a look at. There is a link down below in the stream if you want to check out his channel and figure out what it is he's all about.
Thank you very much. You can call me Ollie, by the way, please.
Ollie. Perfect. So, I suppose we should probably get started.
Lundi, just want to quickly interrupt, and we want to give a big thank you to Ollie, especially because he came in, like, just basically 24 hours ago. I know it's 48, so I'm losing track of times. But thank you very much. It was basically
my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It was basically Friday. I left work. We had a gap in the schedule. I emailed Ollie. He replied within an hour. So a big thank you to him for stepping in at the last. Just had to say that. So
it's my pleasure. I'm very flattered he thought of me. Actually.
Yep. All right, I'll disappear now.
Knowing Zulu, he just typed in philosophy into YouTube and it's just like, Big Lundi, do you know who this person is? Yes, I know who it is. Somebody who's awesome. He's like, okay, we'll put him on.
Thank you very much. That's very kind.
All right. So, I suppose we should probably get started. Both of you have done a variety of different topics as far as, I suppose we could call it public communication of philosophy in general. One of the big things that I usually get into as far as engaging with the public and philosophy is an extreme level of apathy. I think Dan Dennett said it best when he said, I'm a philosophy professor. What that means is when I go to parties and I tell people what I am, they go, oh. So there's just seems to be this complete apathy of philosophy, philosophers, people who just don't seem to see the point, I suppose. And I'd like to get
people even know what it is at all, of course.
Yeah,
several times I go, I study philosophy, and then 10 minutes later they go, so tell me about psychology. And I'm like, I've got no idea what psychology is. Never studied it.
Just because I'm a philosopher doesn't mean that I know a lot about these other things.
No, they think it's the same thing. It's like, they just don't get it. They have no idea.
So I was wondering if
you
could give a bit of a statement as to why it is that you feel that philosophy is important for your general public to at least be semi-informed about. We'll just to have a little structure here. Let's go ahead and start with Ollie, and then we'll go over to Julian.
Oh gosh, why do I think philosophy is important for the general public? Well, I guess it does school you in having an